Good morning and good afternoon to everybody on this call, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the first of a series of virtual video conferences, Carnegie Connect. Today's discussion is going to focus on the politics of pandemic, but before we turn to our truly extraordinary panel, I want to make three rather obvious points to remind myself with some degree of context. Number one, despite the fact that we're going to be analyzing foreign policy and the impact of the pandemic on political and social economic changes in these countries, this is first and foremost a human tragedy. And I need to remind myself of that as this cruel and merciless virus cuts a path of destruction, devastation, illness, death, and social and economic trauma around our world. This really is a matter of individuals, their health and their security. Number two, on a personal note, I really wish that we could do more than offer thoughts and prayers. I think when we get through this, the remarkable story will be of how individual selflessness and sacrifice, first responders, health professionals on the front lines, cared for the sick. On the issue of the governmental level, and perhaps our panelists will contradict me, I think the very notion of governmental function and legitimacy will in fact leave implications and repercussions. I can only say personally as an American that I'm thankful that the founders injected federalism into our political system. Because government's conduct during this crisis, I think, has left a lot to be desired. And finally, I think it's important to point out that we are still in the middle of a trajectory of a virus. We don't know where this is going to end. And I think for any political analyst or observer, that should inject a degree of modesty and humility into this discussion. I have more questions than answers for our panelists. For example, is this going to be a headline or is this a trend line? Are we witnessing a transformative event that is going to reshape international relations and relations among states? Is this pandemic going to empower the populist fringe in Europe? Or is it going to lead paradoxically, even as governments have been to some degree dysfunctional in coping with this crisis, is it going to lead to a greater dependence on centrist governments or centralized control? And finally, with respect to America's leadership, is that leadership or the absence of leadership going to provide opportunities or vulnerabilities to various countries around the world that we're going to assess? I think that Carnegie is uniquely positioned with its global centers to actually offer sage advice and wisdom on these subjects. And I cannot imagine three more brilliant presenters and panelists to connect with today. Paul Henley is the founder and director of the Tsinghua Center in Beijing. He served both on the national security staffs of Presidents George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. Judy Dempsey is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe and longtime journalist. I first met her, she reminded me earlier, during the late 90s when she was working for the Financial Times in Jerusalem. And last but not least, the inestimable Dmitri Trenin, who is the director of Carnegie's Moscow Center and an astute and longtime observer on Russian politics. The format today is quite simple. Each of our presenters, beginning with Paul, is going to offer a few minutes of remarks. I'll engage them in conversation, and then we will turn to your questions. And with respect to your questions, we will have a question and answer period once the presentations have concluded. Let me just read. To ask a question, use the live chat feature in YouTube. Email us at pressoffice@ CEIP.org, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.org, CEIP.org, or tweet us at Carnegie Endow using the hashtag Carnegie Connects. So without further ado, Paul, let me turn this virtual video conversation over to you.
Well, thank you, Aaron. Thank for the overly kind introduction as well. Let me start by addressing two issues up front in my opening remarks that I think our listeners and viewers would be interested in. First is, what's the situation now in China with regard to the coronavirus? And second is, how is the coronavirus pandemic impacting US-China relations? So first, within China, we are seeing indications that the Chinese leadership is feeling more confident, is feeling that it's past the worst stages of the outbreak. Last week, for the first time since the coronavirus situation emerged, China reported no new local coronavirus cases, with the only new ones, the new cases coming from foreigners that were re-entering the country. Since last week, these numbers have remained low, occasionally rising by 1 or 2, but very close to 0. It's right, I think, to question the veracity of these numbers, but nevertheless, it's clear the situation in China has calmed, it has stabilized to a large degree. What's more important, perhaps, than the data that we're getting from the Chinese, because of course you have to be somewhat skeptical about that, is to watch what the Chinese government actually does and what Chinese leaders actually do. It was significant that on March 10th, President Xi visited Wuhan, the epicenter of the crisis. There are now rumors in Beijing that the leadership will hold the 2 sessions, the Chinese National People's Congress in late April or early May. This is obviously an important convening of Chinese leaders, and it was delayed for the first time ever this year because of the coronavirus. If it does proceed next month or shortly after that, it would be a sign that the leadership is feeling quite confident about the ability to prevent senior leaders from being infected. I think also important to watch would be when Chinese government begins reopening the schools in the country, both K-12 and universities. I understand that's beginning to happen slowly. 2 or 3 provinces we have heard have already opened elementary and high schools outside of Beijing. 19 provinces have indicated that by mid-April, they will open high schools and middle schools. So there are a number of indications that China is feeling they have a better grasp on the situation, but they may remain very cautious about a potential resurgence. For example, now all foreign passport holders that enter Beijing must enter a strict 14-day quarantine at their own expense. Now, front and center on the Chinese Communist Party's mind, of course, is how best to balance between reopening the economy, which senior Chinese leaders really want to do, and risking further spread of the disease. This is a very important year for China in terms of the economy. It needs to continue to grow at 6% if it's going to meet the party's goals of doubling GDP by 2020. The first quarter growth numbers were much lower than they had hoped for. It's possible that for the first time since 1976, the Chinese economy will contract. It's possible they could get production and capacity back online in a matter of weeks, but it seems unlikely they're going to reach this 6% growth goal. After previous crises like the SARS outbreak, China experienced a V-shaped recovery. They quickly rebounded their GDP growth after they stabilized the situation. Today, however, even leading Chinese economists are skeptical that that can happen. Our Carnegie colleague, Yukon Huang, has a piece out this week. Chinese economist Fang Gang has talked about this. They've been talking about how China's shift towards a consumer economy, that given that, the difficulty in fully eradicating the disease and preventing resurgences, and the global headwinds facing other major economies now that China has the situation with the coronavirus stabilized, Other countries are now emerging in crisis, and all of that make it extremely unlikely that China will be able to see that V-shaped recovery that it saw after SARS. Let me talk secondly about the impact of the coronavirus situation on US-China relations. I think pretty obvious to our viewers and listeners that the coronavirus has not played out well in the US-China context. It became apparent that we were headed toward a global crisis. And when you think about the downward spiral that we have been seeing in US-China relations over the last year plus, last month, my colleague Lucas Chayan and I wrote a piece urging US-China cooperation on COVID, despite the recent downturn in relations. You know, global pandemic and disease control has always been an area, both in official US-China channels and also in unofficial track 2 Chinese US-China channels, where we have said and agreed that despite the state of the relationship, we should and must cooperate and rise above any hostility in the relationship. We remember, of course, after 9/11, the US and China were able to put aside growing hostility in the early days of the Bush administration and put our relationship on a much more constructive trajectory. This was good US-China cooperation, even after the global financial crisis in 2009. For the coronavirus, the two sides have not been able to do this. Early on, Beijing refused to accept help from CDC teams, from the WHO, even allow them access to China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry was quick to criticize the US government for not being helpful and for what they saw as overreacting by shutting down flights and people coming to the US. The Chinese media was sort of in full court press and attacking the US government for taking little action to help Beijing. Early on from the US side, we saw criticism from the US government aimed at China's initial cover-up of the virus, legitimate criticism and the spread of the virus. China was very opaque in its reporting of the initial coronavirus figures. We also saw gratuitous and unhelpful comments from a number of Trump administration officials, including Secretary of Commerce Ross, reframed the coronavirus as something that would be good for US businesses, that could accelerate the return of jobs to North America. Seemed to be an inclination from many in the US government, certainly hawks in the US government, to kind of kick China while it was down. And that, I would argue, is not helpful. What's even more concerning now, and my colleague Lucas Chayan and I published a follow-up piece to our initial piece, we published it this week, and I encourage other folks to read that, is that now both sides are not only finding their way to cooperate, but they're now in an ugly blame game, and they're using the current situation in many ways to deliberately inflict damage on the other. Beijing has launched an active public relations campaign to say that the virus did not originate in China. It is spreading disinformation through its foreign ministry, embassies, state-run media, with some Chinese even claiming that the virus may have originated in the United States and was brought to China by the American military. On the US side, President Trump, Secretary of State Pompeo, National Security Advisor O'Brien, and other Trump administration officials have continued to refer to the crisis as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. There are reports that the G7 ministers meeting is unable this week to release a joint statement because of Pompeo's insistence to call the virus the Wuhan virus. And even in a race to the bottom to see who can kick out the two sides, to see who can kick out more journalists, more reporters. Beijing recently expelled journalists from the Washington Post, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. So that said, it does appear that there may be some early signs of stepping back from both sides and moving towards some degree of reconciliation. The Chinese ambassador in DC, Cui Tiankai, recently distanced himself from the conspiracy theories that the foreign ministry spokesman had been spreading. that the virus was originated in the US. President Trump this week has said he would stop using the term Chinese virus. And there's also reports the US and China and the Chinese might release a joint statement on global cooperation to fight the pandemic at the coming virtual G20 meeting. That would be a positive step. So let me close, Aaron, my opening remarks by just saying that as the US enters a state of emergency and China emerges from one, it seems to me that this moment is primed for our leaders to try to rise above the political hostility between the two countries, to make every effort to find ways to cooperate, or at least not take actions that make the situation worse. And I think we should try as much as we can to avert a crisis of diplomacy between the US and China, and that we don't let this moment that we have right now slip away.
Well, thank you. Fascinating. And that rising to the occasion would require a degree of vision and foresight that sadly, I'm not sure we've seen, at least yet. Judy, can I turn the virtual stage over to you now?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Super. First of all, thanks, Aaron, for this great technical feat. It's not my great forte, so I'm learning fast. Okay, my job in this is, as briefly as possible, to explain the situation in Europe. A couple of points. First of all, there is no real European, pan-European response to this. And the reason is that the EU institutions do not have a prerogative to deal with health. They deal with competition, they deal with trade, they deal with aspects of energy. Health is not in their remit. Health belongs to the member states. So when the virus broke out in China, there was this kind of laissez-faire attitude, or even, well, it won't happen in Europe. But when it really took place in Lombardy, in Italy, that's when Europeans really got worried. They were slow to react. The machinery was slow to react. But finally, they put restrictions in place, especially in Austria and Bavaria. Remember, Germany is a federal state, and then it became a big federal-wide German issue and situation to actually impose lots of restrictions. So more or less, Europe now has closed all borders, and open borders used to be the kind of the great psychological, political plus side of the EU. Open borders, people can come and go, labor, capital market, everything. The borders have been closed, and even the borders inside Germany have been closed. One of them, one or two, I don't know how it's going to work, but from my own personal experience, we were scheduled to go away for 4 days in Easter up on an island in the north of Eastern Germany, and we were saying, no, it's banned. So, I mean, internal travel is even banned here. This is the first point, that the member states actually call the shots. The second thing is that as a result, the EU has been very slow to come up with any kind of role whatsoever. The third issue is, and it's something very important to watch, is the role of the European Central Bank. I don't know if your listeners know anything about this, but this is the European Central Bank that looks after the Eurozone. And they have stepped in, and with the support of Germany, because Germany is the biggest economy in Europe and the one with the tightest hands on the purse strings, they're loosening billions of help to keep Europe stable and to keep those who are unemployed, giving them a measure of relief, which is hugely important, because the mindset that is taking place in Europe now is a mindset of not so much of instability, but of unpredictability, of fear, of an enormous concern that unemployment will really rise. And if unemployment shoots up without any kind of social net, you can just understand how this will play into the populace. This brings me to the role of the populist parties. It's very interesting on this. Despite the fact that the member states each have their own policies, although most of them now are replicating each other, the populists are at bay because they don't have power, mostly. But secondly, the democratic institutions are proving very resilient, that populations are actually trusting those leaders who are in power at the moment. And it's very interesting to see what's happening, particularly in Germany. I'm based in Berlin. Angela Merkel, who went into quarantine because her doctor proved positive, but Merkel has been tested twice and is negative, but she's staying in quarantine for 2 weeks, not only to show an example, but to show, I mean, this is leadership. But more importantly, Merkel, unlike, she's not commander of the armed forces, this doesn't exist in Germany, unlike France, where President Emmanuel Macron said, oh, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, we are at war with this pandemic. And Merkel took this attitude, hang on, people, I know the spring is coming. I know you're sitting out in the parks. Let's get serious. This is very, very serious. And it's the biggest crisis, not since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which wasn't a crisis, it was a challenge. She said it's the biggest challenge since the Second World War. And this speech, which she made 10 days ago, was extraordinarily galvanizing. And she has her polling popularity rates have shot up, and her party to 36 or 37%. My heavens, if there was an election tomorrow and if you were allowed to vote, but everyone was meant to stay at home. But Merkel has been a kind of standard bearer. This is the first thing. Secondly, in her speech, she didn't refer to Europe. And I don't want to get too Germanocentric, but what's happening now across Europe is, hang on, we cannot do this together. We cannot do this separately. We've got to do it together. And now Italy, the much more support for Italy, helping them. They saw that the Chinese government the regime was sending in masks and everything. I mean, what an insult to a very prosperous part of the world. And so industry, manufacturing, production have been ramped up to help Spain, particularly, who's going through a very, very bad time, and Italy. And there's now a feeling that it's gradually moving away from the member states to the idea of solidarity. We've all in this together, and we've got to support each other. So the support measures are there, and there's going to be bailout measures. Enterprises are going to be supported, especially in Germany. Britain has been very, very slow to come to this. Boris Johnson, like Donald Trump, was in self-denial, and he's weeks behind the curve. And now he's introduced measures as well. This is no scope for Schadenfreude. So that's the European dimension. It's very, very serious. It's beginning to stabilize in Italy. Spain hasn't reached gone down to this level of the curve. We have no idea how serious Britain is going to become. Infections are going up in Germany, but the death rate is extremely low. France infection rate is high. It's the death rate is going down. It's slowly, it's too early to say. We just don't know. A word about the transatlantic relationship. Well, if it was bad before this pandemic, it's pretty awful now. There's a curious, although all the newspapers and television, and especially the public service television, is totally focused on their own countries and the bigger European picture, the subset, especially in the newspapers, is absolute shock about the leadership in Washington. I mean, we could just see what's happening every time President Trump tweets or his press conferences, and there's an extraordinary feeling of dismay and fear and disappointment and disbelief that this could be happening inside the White House. So it's going to be very difficult to see how this transatlantic relationship will recover, but more importantly, and I think this is an issue that has to be addressed, what's going to happen to the multilateral order? And the WHO comes in every day and gives its projections and so on, and the United Nations says things, but the multilateral order, as Paul mentioned with the G7, and even the foreign ministers couldn't agree, it's in very, very bad shape. So what we need, and the Europeans and the Germans, the French and the British and the Italians, plus the Japanese, and indeed broaden it, the Canadians and Australians have to come together to see how to restructure or to revive the multilateral order, not when the pandemic is over, but start thinking about this now.
Judy, thank you. Given the fact that you were responsible for summarizing the views of an entire continent, that they were very, very, very prescient observations. Dmitri, over to you for your analysis of Russia and particularly Mr. Putin.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. I'm very glad to be on the panel today. The virus came relatively late to Russia, so the country did have time to prepare. When it came, it did not come across the border from China. Russia has a very long border. It's 4,300 kilometers long, but it was promptly closed at the end of February. I think it was on the 20th of February that they closed it, much to the displeasure of the Chinese, but they had to act very decisively. So the virus came to Russia by way of Russian returnees coming from holidays in their favorite European countries, such as Italy, Spain, France, and others. The real picture is only emerging. In the last 10 days, about 1 million Russian visitors have come back. The number of tests, the last time I checked, was about 200,000, actually less than 200,000. Of that number, we have, again, by the latest count, 840 cases. And the number of fatalities is still in single digits. So I would say that the country is at the very start of the epidemic. The virus also came to Russia against a very bleak background. A few weeks ago, the oil price plunged, sending both the ruble down and the budget revenues. So the very anemic growth that Russia was experiencing before is rapidly turning into stagnation and very likely recession. The country is treating the crisis very seriously, also because the reform to the healthcare system has not yet produced a modern healthcare system for the country. There's also a test of both the authorities' capacity to perform in the situation when the elites are usually pretty distracted from the needs of the common people. And in a situation when people will have to respond in a way that they have never been asked to respond. And in Russia, the anarchy of the people and the authoritarianism of the authorities have been in some kind of balance, but this balance is now being tested. So in my view, the situation will get worse before we reach the peak of the epidemic. It is a moot question whether Russia is following the Italian way or the Asian way, but no one is making any illusions, and the country is bracing for something pretty serious. But while Russia was watching from the sidelines, it could form an opinion and could learn from the experience of other countries. So just allow me a few takeaways from what the Russians have seen in the last few weeks. I think the first takeaway is that although the world is totally globalized by now, decision-making is very much shared by the government, by the national governments and local governments. The supranational institutions are really sidelined. National sovereignty is key, and a lot of Russians are pointing to the ironic fact that the sanctions imposed on Russia have actually bolstered Russia's capacity to deal with challenges coming from abroad. Another takeaway is that borders matter. They can protect you. That the fundamental issue in politics is governance rather than the dilemma of democracy versus authoritarianism. In this fight against the pandemic, it will not be this regime or that political regime that will show its strength, a lot of people believe, but the professionalism, the competence of the relevant authorities. And governance works best, again, there's another takeaway, in countries where the governments work in sync with societies. So a lot of that depends on culture. If you look at the response of so many people in Asia and so many people in Europe to the pandemic, you see a lot of difference. So self-discipline is key, and it will be it will be a very big challenge for a lot of Russian people, again, given the anarchic nature of the Russian soul, I would say. And very lastly, I think that the Russians have seen China rising from being very much on the defensive, having been seriously challenged at the very beginning, and then getting its act together, and now leading the world out of the crisis and even claiming global leadership in the fight against the pandemic. Europe, as Judy has just pointed out, has demonstrated not only that health is not within the purview of the EU authorities, but that there's a limit to solidarity. In fact, there are very clear limits to intra-European solidarity. And that is a revelation, I think, that some of the old habits are coming back and coming back very quickly. And as far as the US is concerned, I believe that the verdict so far has been that the US is not leading by example and has chosen not to lead by practicing solidarity. And that's another takeaway that will stay with a lot of people. So let me stop here.
Dmitri, thank you. That was superb ground truth, direct from Moscow. And we greatly appreciate it. We have lots of questions, but I think I'll want to ask each of you perhaps the toughest question of all, because it does require a certain amount of predictive capacity. It may or may not be fair to see this pandemic from the perspective of whether authoritarian societies are better equipped to deal with it than democratic polities are. I don't know the answer to that. Certainly with respect to the suppression of information, the Chinese, and stopping the initial pandemic, the Chinese have a lot to answer for. I guess my question, though, focuses largely on the issue of American leadership, a subject I'm very much interested in. And this may well be a transformative crisis, perhaps the first that the United States seems to have been unable or unwilling to lead. I mean, in 2003, the Bush administration was able to assemble and commit $90 billion to its emergency aid program, which I think is the largest sum of money ever committed to fighting a single disease. In 2008, the US took a lead role in the global economic crisis in 2014 in response to Ebola. So I guess my question, since you three represent or study both authoritarian and democratic polities here, how will the absence of US leadership affect the areas that you follow? Will there be winners here with respect to China and Russia, with respect to the absence of US leadership? And Judy, are there vulnerabilities and losers here because of the deteriorating transatlantic relationship and the absence of Washington's leadership? Could each of you offer a brief comment on this, predictive as we move forward? I think our listeners would appreciate it, and then we can go to callers, emailers, and YouTube questions. Paul, do you want to start?
Absolutely. Great question, Aaron. And I think it is the key question of the moment. And let me start out by saying that I think Chinese leaders recognize the magnitude of the moment and see an opportunity both to enhance their own legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese people and even beyond that in the international community. And they see it in many ways as a competition of systems. You know, the Chinese one-party authoritarian system receives a lot of criticism from the international community, and they see this as an opportunity from a geopolitical context to improve their position, to improve their reputation, and to improve their support of Chinese people. It was interesting to hear Dmitri's description of how Russian leadership has sort of characterized the Chinese response, saying that there was, if I heard him correctly, missteps at the beginning, China's getting its act together in the containment and the mitigation phase, and now having to a large degree stabilized the situation, and now even claiming global leadership. Also that the U.S. is not leading by example, that there is not an effort that can be described as solidarity in the United States, and they watch this and they think it gives their own political system and their own efforts much more credibility. To examine, how China feels about the current situation, you have to divide the coronavirus response, their response, into 3 stages. The first was the denial and the cover-up by Chinese officials, which allowed, frankly, the initial spread of the virus and allowed the situation in China to be much, much worse than it needed to be, and frankly, has contributed to the global pandemic that many countries in the world are dealing with. The first cases of coronavirus in China appeared in late November or early December.
Yeah.
The Chinese government didn't lock down Wuhan until January 23rd. And let me just give you one concrete example of the cover-up that we should all understand. And when we get through the coronavirus pandemic, we should go back and sort of examine this. Between January 5th and January 17th, Hubei province was having their annual sessions of their local legislature. During that time, no new cases of coronavirus were announced in China. There was an effort to suppress what was actually happening. And then a day after that, on January 18th, in Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak, the Chinese authorities allowed for an annual potluck New Year's banquet with more than 40,000 people gathered. 5 days later, Wuhan and 3 other cities were put on lockdown. But before they were put on lockdown, 5 million Chinese citizens left Wuhan because of the Chinese New Year, and they were not screened for the illness. So a lot of missteps, and that caused a lot of anger and frustration in China. And there was a case with a Chinese doctor, Li Wenliang, who was trying to get out the information and was stopped by Chinese authorities. And his death shortly thereafter created a bit of a crisis within China. But then, because of the way that China in the containment and mitigation phase cracked down and had a massive mobilization of resources to curtail the virus, to curtail the spread, including shutting down whole cities, rampant testing, temperature checks, the development of massive quarantine facilities, and they exhibited greater transparency in this phase. And now we're at a point where they're reporting no new numbers. And now in the third phase is that Beijing is now stepping up, as Dmitri says, trying to claim global, at least making contributions to global international public goods by offering aid, expertise, and assistance to other countries reeling from the virus spread. And so, this has been pretty remarkable. This past Saturday, Xi Jinping spoke with leaders of Germany, France. It was the second time in 3 days that she had spoken with Macron. Leaders of Spain and Serbia. Germany was the only country of the four that has not yet requested supplies from China. China is now providing aid to Italy, to Serbia, even the EU with masks and ventilators, respirators, suits, and they're providing 20,000 test kits and 100,000 masks to each of Africa's 54 countries.
Paul, that's really extraordinary example of how to turn a catastrophe, a real catastrophe and serious bungling with global implications into a real advantage. Could I get Judy and Dmitri to quickly just offer a takeaway on this, because we have hundreds of people on this call and a lot of questions.
And Aaron, I'm going to be. Will I go, Dmitri?
Yes, Judy, go ahead.
I'll be extremely brief. There's something is emerging in Europe, and since the Europeans cannot rely on the White House administration to show leadership, and actually they distrust the Chinese leadership, truth and transparency are becoming a premium. I said earlier that the democratic institutions are certainly kicking in most countries, not Hungary, by the way, where we see our Prime Minister Viktor Orban trying to use the crisis to impose emergency powers. But there's a sense in the civil society and in the media coverage in Europe and in the leadership that Europe has to protect this special area of truth and transparency. And just looking at the spread of the media coverage among the 27 member states over the past month, it has been remarkable, the lack of polemic and the lack of point scoring. And even though the Chinese have been providing some countries in Europe with supplies, this is not about, oh, we're going to side with China, or Russia has it under control, or Trump is a disaster. This is, I think, the soul searching is beginning to take place in Europe about what it can do to beyond the containment of the pandemic, to actually strengthen the whole institutions of transparency and truth. And I think this is what's at stake here. Yes, they can praise China for taking this under control, if you want to believe the statistics and other things, but the Europeans don't want to get into the blame game. They want to, I think some of the leaders are acutely aware of what is at stake, and what's at stake is preserving the idea of accountability and democracy.
Thanks, Judy. Dmitri, a quick comment on Putin. Can he take advantage of this, or will he somehow be a loser?
Well, he will either bolster his position or lose, depending on how he performs within Russia. What happens outside of Russia is of very little relevance to his position. But let me say that rivalry in the world continues unabated, and even at an accelerated pace within the crisis. But it's not a rivalry between democracy and authoritarianism. It's a rivalry between the United States and China, and at a different level, this is about the performance of the various systems, and that's the issue. So I wouldn't subscribe to the view that this is about either democracy or this is not the playground for a battleground between democracy and authoritarianism. The countries who are doing well include authoritarian countries, semi-authoritarian countries, and democratic countries. And one of the very authoritarian countries, such as Iran, is doing very, very badly. So it's not about that. And as far as Russia is concerned, the opportunity that they see is to show solidarity with the people of Italy as a way to make friends behind the new dividing lines in Europe. This is a geopolitical objective, but at the same time, they're doing it to gain experience. because this is all about experience. So the Russians who are being sent to Italy are gaining valuable experience that will be necessary when they have to fight these things back home, and maybe very soon.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
We have a question from Ron Linden on YouTube. I'll paraphrase to a degree. Do any of you think that as a consequence of this pandemic, that populist or internally nationalist policies, including America First, will somehow be discredited or weakened because of the obvious need for global cooperation and leadership to fight this pandemic and others? Quickly, if you can. Let's try Judy first.
Oy, it's from the European perspective, there isn't these broad attacks on globalization. Actually, this is quite very interesting. From the European perspective, the populists at the moment are at bay because they don't have the tools and the instruments and the experience to deal with this crisis. From the European perspective, there's been a complete absence of discussion of the need for cooperation, but finally it's coming through from some leaders across Europe that this is not just a member state problem or a European problem. This is an enormous global problem. And the most depressing thing I've seen from European leaders is that this is going to require immense leadership from Europe, but particularly from the United States. And because that leadership isn't there, the Europeans are wondering, where is it going to come from? It's certainly not going to come from Europe at the moment.
Thank you. Paul?
You know, my short answer to this is somewhat depressing. I think that globalists, internationalists will, for the reasons that you described, try to articulate that this shows that we need to work together and be less, isolationist and less nationalistic. But those in the United States, for example, that support Donald Trump's America First will argue that this shows because there's a lot of concerns about companies that have been working in China and because global supply chains have been stressed, that maybe our companies should be manufacturing at home. There's a lot of concern, for example, that pharmaceuticals and medicine, a great majority of US pharmaceuticals are made in China. And many Americans are worried that they're going to be able to get their medicine. And so I think both sides will use this particular crisis to buttress their own arguments.
It's a fair point. Dmitri, health and fiscal issues are intensely nationalistic, sovereign issues, but they obviously also have huge international implications. What about, what's your response to the question?
Well, my response would be that, as you just said, Aaron, the nation state has reasserted itself very clearly as a result of this crisis. So governments are calling the shots. On the other hand, the governments will need to collaborate among themselves. And again, I think there will be collaboration, but it will be a more collaboration, but it will be on the government to government level. In a multilateral context or in a bilateral context, but the governments, rather than the universal institutions that have become essentially mostly statisticians in this world. The WHO is the statistician in chief. It's not the headquarters of the global fight against the pandemic. And as for populism, again, as Paul has just explained, the biggest authoritarian regime in the world is now leading the charge in helping other nations with the pandemic. And a lot of liberal democracies are busy, very busy, protecting their own populations. So that would be my answer.
It's a good answer. We have a question here from John Miller Beauvoir on YouTube. Again, I'll paraphrase. The EU is divided. To Judy, is this going to open up a greater north-south divide between a country like Italy, open up questions of sovereign debt, or not?
No, thanks for the very important question. It's a very topical one. I think the mood is changing. The ECB made a big blunder 10 days ago. Christine Lagarde said, oh, they're not responsible for this Eurobond issue or what happens to bonds in Italy. And suddenly something has snapped in the among the European member states. We've got to help each other. And it's going to happen. And this is happening because there's an immense fear of huge unemployment, factory layoffs, shutdowns, and you know what this is going to do. It's going to breed populism and possibly unrest. So it's shifting away. The member states, as Dmitri said, do call the shots, but there's always this balance and back and forth between the institutions, the EU institutions, and the European Central Bank, the member states. I think there's this gradual change that the need for much more support inside the bloc is emerging, and actually it's reassuring.
Thank you. A question from Luke Johnson, who asked on YouTube, essentially, can you trust, to Paul, the Chinese are reporting no new cases. Given their track record, is this because they've stopped testing? How can we trust, and it has a practical implication given the fact that this data is critically important to our own situation here. How can we trust that the Chinese are leveling?
It's a great question. And I think in short, the answer is you can't. You can't trust the data, which is why I've encouraged our viewers and listeners to instead watch the actions of the Chinese leadership. One of the other reasons that you can't trust the data is that the Chinese leadership now has a narrative that they want to push internationally and for their own people. And that narrative is, as I described before, that they took heroic action to step up. And it's frankly, it's as Dmitri described, except for the initial missteps. The Chinese leadership wants the world to be talking about what China did in the containment and mitigation phase. And frankly, China did a good job. But there were huge missteps, as I've described in the beginning, which made the situation much worse for Chinese and for the international community. But what China is trying to do is an active disinformation campaign to spread doubt and confusion over the source of the virus. They do not want people to conclude the virus emanated in China. And that's why the Trump administration is pushing back. That's why Trump calls it a Chinese virus. That's why Pompeo calls it a Wuhan virus. They know exactly what the Chinese leadership are trying to do. They're also trying to downplay and deflect away from the early missteps. So a narrative that says all of that, the fact that there are no new cases in China except for foreigners, comports to that narrative that they want out there. So for that reason alone, because it's a narrative that Chinese leaders want, you can't trust it. It's self-serving in that regard. And again, I would encourage our listeners to watch whether they hold the National People's Congress at the end of April, because they will not want to hold that meeting if they're still worried about the situation in China, because they won't want to infect Chinese leaders. So that's what I would encourage our listeners. A great question, and that would be my answer.
We have a question from Lauren D on email. I think I know the answer to this one, but I'd like your very brief responses. Obviously, the pandemic is having a devastating impact on refugee populations. Idlib in Syria is only one. And clearly, these areas, refugee populations have limited resources to deal with this problem. Or absence of healthcare systems. Do any of you believe that there is any impulse maybe on the part of China, to improve PR, to become more active, either through international agencies or directly in helping to alleviate the situations in some of these truly misery-ridden areas. Any thoughts of any of you?
Yeah, can I jump in very quickly, Aaron?
Yes, please.
You can just, thanks for the great, important ethical question. We can forget it because the Europeans, in any case, didn't step up to the plate when it came to Syria. And we know the US policy on Syria and in Yemen. I mean, now they have become so far away, these countries. Firstly. Secondly, since we didn't really involve ourselves in what was going to happen to Europe's own southern neighborhood, we created this comfort zone. And now that the comfort zone is being punctured by this pandemic, the reaction by the society, not non-governmental organizations, is, hey, we take priority, nobody else. Nobody will say this publicly, but the citizens of each member state matters first. To be fair, some leaders have said we can't forget about the refugees, but we didn't do it before and we're not going to do it now.
I mean, I think that concisely and economically sums up. That's my view, and I suspect, in the interest of time, I'll speak for Dmitri and Paul on this one. Paul, we have a question from Beavers 1985 on YouTube. China is taking all kinds of visible actions to improve its image, and yet it's only contributing a small percentage, I think 3%, to WHO coronavirus programs. Why the disconnect? Is it easier and more beneficial for the Chinese to do this directly and raise their image and profile in that way?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I have the specific answer, but I think that's probably right. They want to support these international organizations and show that they're contributing members, but they also want to get credit for their own actions for China and China alone. And I think they see this as a huge strategic opportunity. In October, I wrote a piece with my colleague Sam Bresnick about I agree with Dmitri, by the way, that this is really about US-China at the end of the day. And I think the Chinese see it that way as well. The narrative in the US is that the Chinese must just be so frustrated with Trump because of the trade war. And Trump likes to say he's the first US leader to have stood up to the Chinese. But the reality is actually a bit different. Many Chinese leaders and strategists, long-term strategists, see a strategic opportunity with Donald Trump as president of the United States, because he is, in their view, eviscerating key pillars of strength in dealing with China. The first is a stable domestic situation at home in the United States. Donald Trump creates division. There's a lot of political turbulence in the US. Second is US international reputation is in tatters. And then third, our support to our very, very important alliances, both the transatlantic and our alliances in Asia, are undermined by President Trump and his administration. And the Chinese see this as a strategic opportunity, and the coronavirus situation emerges, and they want to take advantage of this. And so they want to be seen in the global community as stepping up as a country to contribute to aid and assistance as a key global contributor. And as Dmitri says, claiming global leadership in this regard. And so I think that's why, to the questioner, that's why the emphasis is on what China's doing individually as a country to help, as opposed to how much they're contributing financially to the WHO.
Thanks, Paul. We have 2 minutes left, and actually 1 minute left. So I'm going to ask one question, and I hope one of you in a minute. It's the hardest question of all. I asked initially whether or not there was any sense that this was a headline or a trend line. I mean, I cannot imagine, frankly, that this is not a transformative event. in world history, in global community. Not entirely persuaded how it's going to actually impact. 1918 Spanish flu became part of a much larger transformative event, World War I. So it was sort of encompassed by the extraordinary changes that World War I brought into play. But would any of you want to venture, literally, or actually out of time, in 30 seconds, what is the single greatest change you think this pandemic may have wrought? One of you, I know it's maybe impossible, and if you can't answer it, not to worry. But I think it is the question Carnegie will be thinking about for weeks, months, and I suspect years to come. And would anyone like to offer a thought before we close? Dmitri, I couldn't be happier that you raised your hand.
Thank you, Aaron. I think that this crisis has demonstrated physically the limits of globalization. It is bringing back borders. It is placing people at a safe distance from one another. And this will be that's not the transformative thing by itself, but it's one of those events that brings so many other processes into some kind of a irresistible movement. So I think the world will be different after that, and it will never be what it used to be before that. More serious than terrorism. It's more serious than 9/11 in my view.
I would like to think, and I'm getting too old, I think, to think this way, that maybe the opposite might have actually have occurred. People will acknowledge the realities of borders and national sovereignty, but understand that those borders are, well, in the face of this cruel and merciless virus, what do those borders really mean? And I take your point, Dmitri. First of all, I want to thank the three of you. This has been a remarkable session for me. We had at one point, I think, over 700 people on this call. And we'll definitely have another. So thank the three of you, truly, and everyone who called in. And I can honestly say, until the next Carnegie Connect. Take care.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dmitri. Thank you, listeners.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Paul.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.